The Battle of Verdun was started on February 21st, 1916, when 1,220 German artillery guns around the 8-mile sector opened fire on French lines. This battle was not to decisively beat and rout the enemy, rather than to bleed him to death. It was a battle where at least 262,000 men fell along a front of only 15 miles long. The Battle of Verdun was the first major German offensive since the Race to the Sea, and German General Erich von Falkenhayn had high hopes for the battle. He believed that the best strategy for Germany was the doctrine of attrition. In a letter to Kaiser Wilhelm II in late 1915, Erich von Falkenhayn told him that the United Kingdom was the most formidable of the Allies, but said that she could not be directly attacked, concluding that France should be focused on the future offensives, saying that if the French army could be adequately destroyed, then the war could be won. He would get his wish at 7:15 a.m. on February 21st. The Germans would begin their initial bombardment on the sector around Verdun. At 7:15 a.m. on February 21st, the German guns lit up and began a massive bombardment of a front around 25 miles long. At 4:45 p.m., the first German infantry attack was launched. This initial attack completely shattered French forces in the region, as a combination of the confusion of the massive artillery barrage and the assault of the German infantry caused massive loss of territory and retreat of French forces. As early as January 1916, the French had spotted a concentration of German forces around the area of Verdun, and French efforts to hastily bolster the French defenses in the area started. These efforts to quickly increase the strength of the forces defending Verdun caused massive logistical issues and would prove to be an Achilles heel of the early French defense. The next day, the Germans would successfully repel a French counterattack. By February 23rd, the villages of Bermont-Sameuse, Vivu, and Saint-Manu were in German hands. The situation for the French was critical. They were completely driven from the first line of defense, their second and third lines were inadequate, and were also abandoned. There is almost nothing stopping the Germans now. The Germans continue to advance further and further to Fort Douaumont, where the French plan to make their defense. But something went awry, and the French only had 56 reservists defending the fort, and the Germans easily pushed through and occupied the fort. The fall of the fort opens up the Germans to the spoils of Verdun, which is easily within reach. After the devastating early defeats of the French, General Philippe Pétain reorganizes the French defenders to hold the right bank of the River Meuse at all costs. Pétain also sets up the defenses around the remaining forts defending the area around Verdun. Pétain believes the most important thing to do at this point is to buy time and stall the Germans long enough to bring in fresh divisions and set up a defensive perimeter. This opportunity is seen in the village of Douaumont. The initial attack of the Germans goes smoothly, and they are slowly making gains. The Germans encounter fierce opposition from the French, who have taken up the defense along the hills situated around the Ardemont fortification. After fierce resistance, the French are forced to draw back as the threat of German artillery looms in the area. This defense bought crucial time for the French, as they were able to set up a defense around Fort Vaux, and the entirety of the village Douaumont was turned into a heavily armed fortress. On February 28th, a German attack is stalled, and an eyewitness recalls the attack. The soldiers fell over like tin cans. Almost all of our officers get hurt or killed, and many of our men get killed because of our own artillery fire, which is too close and therefore causes many victims. It is clear that the German attack was stalling and would soon evolve into a cacophony of death, agony, failed attacks, and trench warfare, with little to no meaningful territorial exchange.
The Germans failed to gain a decisive victory at Verdun. For the next 4 months, the Germans smashed into the French lines to no avail. They never ultimately gained a decisive victory, which allowed them to finally capture Verdun. After the creation of the offensive of the Somme, the French tried to exhaust the Germans as much as possible before the offensive. For 4 months, the Germans would continue to attack both sides of the banks of the river Meuse. On March 8th, the Germans started their offensive to capture Le Mont-Homme in the village of Douaumont. By the start of June, both of the objectives were in the hands of the Germans, but at a high cost of German casualties and morale. The last German offensive would begin on June the 1st. The Germans attacked Vaux and the Mont, two strong points on the French line. After days of back and forth fighting, the Germans would finally capture them both by June 9th. While the Germans retained the initiative at Verdun, the Germans' efforts would be cut short by Russian offensive in Austria-Hungary. Manpower would have to divert to stop the Russians, and the offensive stalled. By June 21st and by the 27th, the French were under harsh pressure from the Germans on their right flank. The combined British and French campaign at the Somme started on June 24th with a week-long artillery barrage. Its aim was to force the Germans to take out forces from Verdun in order to stop the attack at the Somme. This did force German troops from the area, but did not stop the attacks, and on July 11th, the Germans made another attack on Verdun. This attack was halted, and they attacked again on August 1st. This attack also failed, and with a French counterattack on the 3rd, the Mont was taken back. This was shortly taken back by the Germans on the 8th, but it showed a clear message the tide was turning at Verdun. Fighting continued throughout the month, and on September 3rd, the last German attack yielded no gain. In September, a plan was proposed by French General Charles Mangin that proposed a plan for the liberation of the entire Verdun region. The French offensive started with an artillery barrage on October 20th. The French retook Dumont, and by November 2nd, they recaptured Fort Vaux. The offensive resulted in heavy losses for the French, and General Mangin was nicknamed the Butcher. By December 19th, the French had established a front line to its original state of February 21st. That battle was finally over and ended with a French military victory. The original goal of the battle, devised by Erich von Falkenhayn, was to bleed the French to death. He was successful not only in bleeding the French to death, but also the Germans. It is estimated that a total of 714,231 casualties resulted from the battle, with around 262,308 dead or missing in action. The French and Germans almost lost the same amount of men evenly, splitting the casualty number to 337,231, with about 162,308 missing or dead for the French, and 337,000 casualties, with around 100,000 dead or missing for the Germans. A number of eyewitnesses recount the horrors of the combat in Verdun. A German soldier writes to his parents, "An awful word, Verdun. Numerous people, still young and filled with hope, had to lay down their lives, here their mortal remains decomposing somewhere, in between trenches and mass graves at cemeteries." Another German soldier writes, "The men who have lived in these trenches just as long as our infantrymen, without going insane under these infernal attacks, must have lost their sense for a large number of things. Our poor men have seen too many atrocities, have witnessed too many incredible matters. I cannot believe that we will be able to cope with this. Our poor little minds simply cannot comprehend all of this." A French soldier says, "Everyone who searches for cover in a shell hole stumbles across slippery, decomposing bodies and has to proceed with smelly hands and smelly clothes."
As stated above, the goal of the Germans was to bleed the French to death at Verdun. The Germans believed that if they could inflict enough casualties on the French, they could be overrun and defeated. This is certainly what he accomplished at Verdun. The Germans took 377,000 French soldiers out of action, and in the following year of 1917, the French morale and manpower was in a critical state. French units were in large-scale mutiny, and it was uncertain how much longer the French could continue the war. This can be attributed to the high French casualties in battles like Verdun, if not for the joining of the United States into the war and the delivery of fresh American troops in 1918. The Germans would have been able to break the French lines in their 1918 summer offensive, possibly making enough gains to garner a good peace with France. So overall, it was a good strategy, and if not for the arrival of the American troops, the war could have been won by the Germans.